So the project is called The Door of the Door, and that means in Hebrew from generation to generation. And it is a oral history project documenting one specific synagogue's history in the community. I moved to the town that the temple is in, Muskegon, Michigan, 4 years ago, and I am Jewish, so I started looking for a temple and came across this one completely by accident because they don't have any sort of presence in the web. There's like a phone number that you can leave a message for. It's pretty hidden. And so I went, and within a few times of going, I realized that this was a really unique institution, both in terms of like Muskegon is a small working class town that has gone through a lot of economic and cultural challenges. And this temple has existed here for over 100 years, but nobody knows about it. And so for me, thinking through the people that I'd been meeting and specifically the rabbi and his relationship to the community, and then just the fact that this historical institution has been there for so long but is so unknown, is where that desire to build a project around it came from. For me, it was about the desire to tell the stories. And so I saw myself as sort of a go-between in the university being able to get resources out to the institution or to the temple, and then having the temple members themselves help sort of define what needed to be collected to participate in these interviews, help gather material for documentation. So for me, it was more of I would say like a manager than the creator of the project, right? The creation came from the group. So when I first heard about the Kutsche grant, right, to the collaborative, community collaborative grant, I knew that I wanted to do this with the temple, but I also knew that in order to get temple buy-in, I had to explain it and get them to understand sort of my goals. So I started with just talking to the synagogue membership, or at least the most active members, in after services, just sort of bringing up, there's this grant, I think it would be really interesting. This is what I'm imagining would happen, and getting just a little bit of buy-in. And then eventually, once I had sort of spread the word, I presented to the board the ideas that I had and the parameters of the grant, and got their permission. They voted on it. And so after that, and I wrote the grant and got the grant. After that, I started having sort of regular meetings with people at the synagogue, the rabbi and his wife, and then some of the more active members, just to sort of talk through what it is that we were trying to do, because they had a sort of traditional history written almost 40 years ago now. And so I wanted to talk about how it would be different. And then as part of that grant, I had that I created a class, right? And that class was about learning oral history skills, but also exploring Jewish identity and partnering in the community with the synagogue. So when I built that class, I used the resource of the rabbi who helped me sort of come in and talk about not just the temple and not just the history of the temple in Muskegon to my students, but also sort of just broadly, what is Judaism? Because none of my students were Jews. So they'd had to learn everything about it. And so that was helpful because I was able to sort of incorporate the lessons that I wanted them to understand about like Jewish community identity through the practice of it, through the rabbi. And then we had to go back and get people to sign up to do interviews. So we, with the temple board's partnership, we ended up setting up a few interview dates. And we would come out, the students and I, with all of our material and all of our recording stuff, and we would pair off with different members and record their stories. And then We also created small sort of subgroups of temple members who were interested in the documentation portion of the project, who gathered together to sort of sort through heaps and heaps and heaps of old photographs and newspapers and paperwork in order to identify people in them, or to determine whether this was something that was valuable enough to like create a digital copy of. And that is still ongoing because it's a lot of stuff. But for the most part, it was a lot of offering sort of, this is what I hope we can use this experience for the temple. My goals, of course, were not the goals of the synagogue, right? I thought we could create this project and then like you could have a web presence and people would know you existed. And that is not, they don't care about that. But they do want to have a more sort of detailed, identifiable, and like human-centered understanding of who they are and where they've been. And so that's really what the end result is starting to look like in terms of the exhibit itself and the digital archive. So when the rabbi would come to class to talk about sort of the history of the temple or just broad Jewish concepts, one of the things we would ask were questions that we had prepped as we started thinking about what it is we wanted to know, because we wanted to document the history of the community, the synagogue community. But we also, for a lot of students, they were really interested in just Jewish identity and politics more broadly, like what is special or unique about that kind of identity. And a lot of people wanted to ask questions that reconciled sort of what they saw as Jewish principles with the politics that are happening in the world right now, and how Jews themselves make sense of that. And so when the rabbi would come, we would talk a lot about sort of the specifics of the history and the questions that we were having and his ideas about the answers we might get or ways to get that information. But my students and I sat down collectively on our own too, to sort of determine the major areas we wanted to focus on for our interviews. And we came up with two different major focuses. One is your relationship and experiences with the synagogue, and the other was your relationship and experiences with Jewish identity, because we wanted to see if they were connected. And so then we went into the temple and did a sort of focus group style interview with a bunch of the members all at once, asking some of the questions that were more broad, that weren't super unique, and we wanted to get a more collective idea about. And doing that, and then having that data and being able to like go through it, helped us create more individualized questions. And then we went in and did our individual interviews using this set of questions that we'd slowly filtered down to be targeted at exactly what it is we wanted. So it was a bit of working with the synagogue, specifically the leadership, in order to craft the concepts and get the ideas of how to get to those concepts. But the students actually did a lot of the work of, if we want to know this, how can we ask a question that might get us to that answer? So the exhibit is going to be at the Lakeshore Museum, which is a small sort of interactive history museum in Muskegon. And they had been interested in creating a series of exhibits that focused pretty closely on elements of the Muskegon community, to get more community buy-in into the museum itself. So we're their test case. And we put together an exhibit that will explore both the history of B'nai Israel, which is the name of the temple in Muskegon, and a sort of broad look at what Judaism even is, because Muskegon does not have a lot of Jews. West Michigan does not have a lot of Jews. And so in some ways, it's this like very confusing and unknown culture for a lot of people in West Michigan. So we wanted to provide, the temple specifically wanted to provide a little bit of background on what it is that they do and believe, so that it demystifies it for people. So what it will contain is a little element of history. As you walk in, there will be sort of a part of the exhibit that talks about the creation of the synagogue starting in 1888 and pulls you through till today in terms of the things that they've done, the buildings that they've inhabited or built, the relationships they've had with community agencies or members, and so on and so forth. And then we decided collectively that we needed to talk about Judaism through 3 different kinds of conversation and spaces. So those spaces are school and education, the synagogue itself, and home. So we're setting up a classroom that is modeled on the classrooms that exist in the actual synagogue. That will have information about what is taught and why education is important to Jews and what that looks like. And then there will be like Hebrew letters and whatnot, and an interactive portion so kids can come in and play games or whatnot. And then you'll walk through into a part that is the synagogue. And that will contain a lot of information about like Jewish ritual and practice. But it will also have one of the temple Torahs will be there. There will be some pews. It will be set up like the synagogue at temple. And so we're borrowing a lot of material from them. And there will be different sort of things that kids can touch and try on. There's a chuppah, which is like the ceremonial wedding cover thing, like a tent. And that is going to have like dress up clothes for kids in it. Maybe, I don't know, maybe not COVID. And there's going to be photographs all over of different members of the temple's rituals, like their weddings or their bar bat mitzvahs or whatnot in the synagogue, so that it's like a humanized understanding of it. And then the final part is the home, which will be set up like a kitchen dining room. And it will have elements of sort of Jewish practice in the home. So what kind of foods, what kind of like a menorah, that kind of stuff. And a lot of this we're pulling from the temple, or temple members are donating it for use in an exhibit. So there'll be actual home, like family heirlooms. And the more delicate ones will of course not be touchable. But there'll also be, again, a lot of interactive stuff for all ages. And then the final part, the final element is this sort of interactive board where they're focusing on this Jewish concept called tikkun olam, which means to heal the world. Because for the temple, their perspective on what they really want people to walk away with was this idea that Judaism is about learning, it's about questioning, and it's about social justice. So that last part is going to be an explanation of tikkun olam, and then asking visitors to the exhibit to consider writing one thing they want to do to change the world or heal the world, and then posting it up. So that's going to be like a constantly moving list of things people are engaged in doing to aim towards social justice. So students were involved in every single part of this project. So in the very beginning, students were involved through the class in determining sort of what kind of data we needed, and then actual data collection. And my requirement, and they did a great job at this, they did better than I could have expected, was that they also enter the synagogue as people who are willing to learn and willing to build these relationships, so that they aren't just dropping in, collecting data, and dashing. So they actually had to go to 4 different weekend services. And the first couple, they just had to sit and like listen. They could ask some questions or participate in the dialogue, but they really needed to like take the time to get to know the people and the culture that existed in that space before I would let them actually collect data. And so they did that, and they did these mini analyses as part of that class of the interview data that they collected. And I will say that it was remarkable. The people they interviewed all came to me. Maybe 95% of them came to me and said, that was amazing. I really loved whomever the student was. That was so great. So they really enjoyed that part, and the students, I think, got a lot out of it just based on what they were sharing with me. After that semester ended, one of my students, Joel Hill, was super interested in continuing his participation with the project. And so he and I worked together to help him apply for a summer scholar grant through the Hours office. And as part of that grant, he got to take on sort of the leadership in working with the museum. And so he really was sort of the main driver at that point. And so he set up meetings between us and members of the synagogue and the Lakeshore Museum, and did a lot of planning and brainstorming and bringing together everybody's ideas in order to begin to build the exhibit. And then his project was to sort of do a prototype and present it. And he did that. And that ended, but he continued to stay on sort of for free, and continued to work on the project until just recently. He just left because he graduated and now is like a Teach for America candidate out in Detroit, but still very connected. And then other students who were part of that initial course also stayed very connected in various ways. So I had one student who their background was in computer programming and statistics. And so that person ended up working with the data that we had collected, the oral interviews and the photographs, in order to make a digital exhibit, which will be incorporated into the face-to-face exhibit. And then other students have stayed on just in terms of like continuing to show up. They show up at Temple randomly. They did before COVID. So those relationships they built were sustained outside of the class, if that makes sense. Like they developed personal connections, and those are ongoing for them. And then as much as I could, I continued to incorporate the students who started it, and anyone who was interested could come on board too, just to build the actual exhibit or build the project beyond just that initial data collection. In one way, I'm very lucky because this particular project and the subject that we are looking at is steeped in like an ideology that has always valued questioning and education. So like coming in as somebody who is a teacher, the synagogue was automatically receptive because teaching is a huge element and learning is a huge element of Judaism. And so there definitely was sort of already a built understanding that I could have these dual roles and that they could benefit and offer something. But there have been times when I felt like I needed to either pull myself back because I wasn't, it wasn't a place for me to like exert my leadership or authority. Then there's a lot of times I've had to do a lot of self-reflection about, well, the definition of this concept for me looks like this, but that doesn't mean that that's what it looks like for other people. And there's it's a lot to keep track of. So one of the days we went there, the students were doing the focus group interview that afternoon. And so first there was the synagogue service, and then after that we would do the interview. And in the middle of the service, the members started getting text messages. They're like just as addicted to their phones as the students are. And it turned out that was the day of the Pittsburgh Temple synagogue shooting. So it was happening while we were sitting in this building doing Temple. And my students had gone into the weekend thinking about why so many of the Temple members talked about how they'd never experienced any sort of anti-Semitism. There was a lot of like, oh no, that we know it exists, but it's never really happened to us, and we're not worried about it, and da 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 da. And so they were really curious about that disconnect. And then with the shooting happening while we were there, and the like live reaction to it, it meant that when it came time for us to do the interview, there was a lot more emotional like upheaval than we had expected initially. People in our temple knew people in that temple. Like some of the people who were murdered were had a relationship or were some sort of relation to people that we have in the membership. So it's real personal. And so in the middle of that interview, which I didn't do, I didn't ask any of the questions. I had the students ask the questions because I really wanted them to feel ownership and leadership and practice. I had to sort of take them aside and say, some of these questions might be too heavy for this moment, and they might feel really pointed in a way that won't be useful. So we had to sort of get rid of a few. And we also had to pivot and ask, okay, so we're sitting through this. Like, we're in a world where there is somebody dying in a temple right now because of anti-Semitism. Why, what does that feel like for you, right? To the membership. And so for me in that position at that moment, it felt really difficult because I had like my emotional reaction to being in a synagogue while another synagogue was being was having this violence happen, and realizing that we were at risk of violence, right? And then also having to figure out how to put my teacher hat on and manage the situation from like we still need to collect data, we still need to think about this, how can we talk about this very loaded topic in this moment with these people without it devolving into something that is just too much for any of us to take on right now. So it can be hard, the insider outsider stuff. It's also hard because I know so much about a lot of the members that were being interviewed that I would be like, oh, we really need to ask about this, which if I didn't know these people, I wouldn't know these things to pull these stories out, which can be a benefit, but can also be problematic because they might not want to share that publicly. So there was also a lot of sort of negotiation. Are you comfortable sharing these kinds of things? And I would push during group interviews to get answers I knew that our membership had, opinions they had about things that they weren't sharing, because I needed the richness of the multiple opinions, and being an insider allowed me to do that. But you know, it's always like an ethical line. How much do I push based on personal relationships versus my professional connection to these members? I think that primarily it takes a lot of planning. Um, even though I had been talking with the synagogue leadership and membership for a while about it, it still felt pretty stressful to begin that process of bringing students in and working with them. Um, so I think use the resources that your community partner has. Don't assume that what you've got is all you can use, right? So we used the rabbi's knowledge. We used a lot of the stuff that they've already collected for sort of archiving, although that just sort of sat in a corner, right? We used a lot of that material. The other thing is I was very, very conscientious to ask what the temple wanted, because what I wanted to look at was not what the temple membership had hoped to come from it. And so when we were building it, I had to sort of put aside my own desires or find a way to embed what I needed in really focusing on what they wanted, which was this people's history, essentially, of the temple. Um, and then think about reciprocity, because we were using a lot of their time. I was bringing students into the synagogue a few times over the course of the semester, which meant we were also taking up space in the temple, right? And taking up time for our membership, or the membership there. So we were really conscientious about what we could do to give back. So one of the things that I set up with the temple was I lead a series of educational workshops for them that they asked for, that they've decided this is the topic we want to know about. And so I will create a little workshop on it as sort of like a exchange, right? They gave me their time and attention. Now I'm going to give them something that meets their needs. So that was part of it. And then the exhibit that is coming out of it is really based not on what I had wanted initially to put together, but what the temple membership really wanted to see happen with this information and these stories. So really, it takes a lot of prep. You have to engage in thinking about what you can offer to your partner and not just what you need from them. And sometimes that means you have to sort of shift around what it is you had hoped for in order to meet the goals that are shared. For me, it was real powerful to watch um, for me, the unexpected part of the connections that they were making, which was that there was obviously more buy-in on both the temple membership part and the student part, but the fact that the students were able to come in and offer something to this group made them feel valued, which in terms of a learning experience is particularly useful and important for students to become engaged and then to want to continue. So I think had they not made such the temple members not made such a strong impression on the students and vice versa, there wouldn't have been nearly as much of a forward progress, right, on the project. I think that because the project wasn't just learn these oral history skills, it was also uh, here's why we want to learn them, here's the project itself, and what kind of questions we want, and being able to work with students to develop that, right? Like what I wanted to learn was not what the students necessarily wanted to learn, which is not what the membership of the temple wanted to share. And so they got to see what that negotiation looks like, and they got to like incorporate their own desires into the questions. A lot of the questions that they asked about, say, the Palestinian Israeli conflict, that came from the students' questions, not from mine, and certainly not from the temple, who would like to pretend there's no conflict, right? And so so being able to like change the shape was really powerful to them in terms of the data. And the temple itself really loved having the students participate in their various programs. So they loved having them come to service because they don't often have guests, and they certainly don't often have young guests. And so they loved having younger people there. Um, they, and especially the rabbi, because of the makeup of the class, the demographics of the students in the class, they sort of had to push themselves to learn a lot about gender and pronouns and various sort of identities that they themselves hadn't been taught about. And they did it. They were really invested in learning how to create a space that felt safe and comfortable for my students, which was not something I expected them to do because we were there to like do something with them, not expecting them to give back. And that has been a long-term change in terms of the dynamic of the synagogue. They are very committed now to like, especially around issues of queerness, creating a safe space, which has been really interesting. Because I'm sort of an insider outsider, right? I'm there as a member, but I'm also there as this researcher. And so I'm seeing both sides of it. And that has been powerful. And then I think it just gives students A, ownership, and B, sort of a level of more connectedness to their community. None of these students, except for Joel, lived in Muskegon. So none of them really had any connection to the town. But they were able to create these connections, and it's powerful. They keep getting drawn back to it. And I especially think that the people they collected data from, so the members of the temple, being able to sit down one-on-one with a younger person in this case, and share their life story was really powerful. They hadn't been asked these kinds of questions before. We had a few people who were interviewed who I sort of expected to be uncomfortable and short and curt. And I tried to be really conscientious about who I paired them with in terms of which student would be doing their interview. And it was remarkable. They would open up to these young people and then send me messages afterwards that were like, oh my God, I totally loved talking to the student. She was so great. And I hadn't thought about these things. And they talked about pretty heavy things, death and loss and grief. And so I think that seeing the connections that students made with the community was also really powerful. And for a lot of traditional age students, there's not a lot of connections, especially in the project with elderly people, right? They don't have a lot of that, and they want it. And so did the members. They wanted that connection, and I don't think they expected to have that happen. And so that was kind of neat to watch too. I think that it is something that takes a lot of setup, and you have to be really conscientious about what it is that you are offering and what it is you are taking, and making sure there's a balance with your community partner. I've set this up as a formal community partnership, but there are other things I've done in other parts of my job in terms of classes where I'm not comfortable officially calling it that yet, because I don't feel like we're doing enough for those community partners, right? Like, I don't feel like there's enough reciprocity. So if you're setting something up like this where you're going in and you're taking their stories, you need to be able to give them back something. And if you can't do that, then you need to rethink how you're going to make this connection or what you're going to do with this organization. Uh, I I hate the idea that our institution might just poach stories and then not give back. And so sitting with your community partner, your potential community partner, and figuring out what they want or need and what you want or need and where the in between is. And then also what you can give them, whether it's directly related to this information that you're getting or if it's something different. Like, I have to go in and teach them about gender identity every once in a while at Temple, right? And so I think you really have to be conscious about that reciprocity, and you have to set it up. And then I created a formal, I have a formal sort of form that I use that I get the community partner to sign, and I sign, that states, this is what we're going to do for you. This is what we're hoping to get from you. And this is the dates, right? Like, it's in parameters that are pretty laid out. And so I try to follow that pretty strictly, but it takes a lot of work to set it up. But once it's set up and once it's going, it can be really powerful and impactful for students and for the community if it's done in a way where people feel like they are actually getting something out of it on both sides. When I was building the syllabus for the class, I wanted to really push uh, a section on the ethical relationships and standards and expectations. And so the A had to read and consume a lot of material about sort of what, specifically from a feminist standpoint. So what are the ethics of when you're collecting someone's story? What does that mean? And we practiced doing interviews and asking about sort of sensitive topics with each other. And then they had to like write up a response or an analysis of what their peer said in order to feel what it felt like to be responsible to share someone else's story. Um, and we spent a ton of times talking about sort of authority and what role the researcher plays in a project where their voice is going to be heard, but it shouldn't be the center. Um, and then I made sure that they practiced some really sort of focused on ethical relationship practices. So one of the things we did was we shared our questions before we did our interview. We had follow-up questions, so like they didn't exactly always stick to the script, but they got to see our main points. And then after the data was collected and the interviews were done and transcribed, we sent the transcription back to each member so that they could go through and edit out parts they didn't want to share publicly. And they, of course, there's some IRB questions about consent. And as an oral history project, technically you don't need consent, but because we were so concerned about making sure we were respecting everybody's autonomy and making sure we were practicing what we preach, we got informed consent from every participant. And we did it multiple times in multiple ways. Like, we got it for their individual interviews, for the group interview, and for photographs and whatnot. And so once the membership got back their transcripts and they went through and edited them, then I had Joel at that point was the one who was primarily working on this. he went through and he edited the audio and the transcript. So there were 2 versions of each interview. There was a clean version, which is the kind that, or the version that goes up on the archive, or that it will be shared at the museum. And then there's a deeper version, which we can use for other forms of analyses. But since that wasn't the main goal, and they know that, like the membership, I told them many times, like, we want to have a clean version that you are comfortable sharing publicly, and then the version with the stuff that's more private that will be used in a very different way, anonymized and so on and so forth. And they were okay with that. But it was a process because there was a lot of like, I don't want to sound dumb. And we had certain members who felt like they came off as too negative or something. They just wanted to throw the whole thing away and not do it, right? And so there was some conversation with the members about, we recognize that you feel self-conscious about this. But here's why we think it's important that your story is shared. And that was an ongoing conversation. It's still ongoing with some of our members, because they want to appear a certain way, and we're sort of not so much interested in how they appear, but what they're telling us. And so it was a tension. But being able to work with the students through that tension and negotiate that was really, I think, useful for them, because they could see sort of how difficult that negotiation might be. And they could like learn how to actually engage in that kind of negotiation. So it was a lot. I worried a lot about how we might practice this in a way that felt ethical. And I was lucky because the students who were engaged in it were very conscious of those things too, just on their own. We really worked hard to extra inform them and say, this is important, and that's why we want you to have the right to refuse. It's a process, but I think it's a really useful one, because ethics are hard to teach. So if you can put them in practice, I think that's a good way for students to learn them. And it makes them understand the value of someone's story. If they're willing to share it and you've gone through sort of the ethics behind it, I think they understand that it's a pretty special thing. For me, I think that oral histories are incredibly useful for telling the pieces of history that often get left out. If you go and if you're studying history or you're reading history books, you're often reading sort of the official account. And as somebody who is really interested in how people negotiate and think about identities and how sort of context, historical context, cultural context shapes those things, I think that the stories you collect through an oral history are much more rich, and I think demonstrate a kind of humanity that maybe traditional historical methods don't always access, because these are human stories. And so I think it's really important as a way for us to understand the complicated lives that people lead during these various historical times or events. I also think that, especially now, because our world is so much more digital, having access to it through these technologies means that it will last a lot longer, right? One of the main drivers for me doing this project was because the temple membership is all pretty elderly. I think the average age is 70, and they aren't getting a lot of new members, and the rabbi has been there for 45 years and he's going to retire one day, and the temple will just fade. This 100+ year institution will just sort of fade away. And I wanted them to have the opportunity to like leave something behind if that was to happen. And so with digitizing these materials, the interviews and other material we've been pulling from the temple, it allows that sort of foreverness to it. That story exists for people to find. And I think that is incredibly important right now, just because we move so quickly and we're leaving so much behind, that being able to have these archives where we can go through and find the material and do it from wherever, right? Somebody can be in a totally different part of the world and go in and find these interviews and learn something about identity or Muskegon or whatnot. And I think that's pretty powerful.